that you'll have lots of questions.
Hmm.
And I'm going to encourage as many questions. And I know that I've cut you off a little bit today because we talked about an hour, but I'll give you until 4 o'clock. And if we need more time, we'll reschedule something with you folks, okay? And I'll put
Okay.
it on the schedule today. So let's just start out. Um, one of the things before we get to it, what the topic today is about the 6 freedoms of the First Amendment. And I think that's important to talk about. And I always like to talk about that because people have an assumption about what those freedoms are. They sometimes think, oh, I know what those are. And so, what I usually ask people, well, what are they? And they say, well, you got freedom of speech, and you got, and then they'll say, oh, freedom of religion. And that's really where people sometimes get a little bit misstep. There's no such thing as a freedom of religion. There are 2 religious protections within the First Amendment, which are important and sometimes conflict with each other. There's the right to free exercise. So that means you have the right to exercise whatever faith you want to. I think we're all familiar with the fact that many people came to the United States with the intent of coming here to practice their religion the way they wanted to. And that created a very pluralistic and interesting fabric within the United States, is what I would say. But then we also have what we call the Establishment Clause. And the Establishment Clause is meant to keep the state or the government from establishing a religion that somebody has to adhere to. Today in our society, we may not think of that or not consider the fact that about a state mandated religion. But if you think about where our founders were coming from, they were used to the Church of England, and they were caught up in that kind of situation. So then we've got these 2 rights. We have the 2 rights in the religion clause, what we call the religion clause: the right to free exercise, the right to be free from establishment. We have the right to petition, the right to a free press, and we have the right to assemble. Now, the right to assemble is kind of expansive too, in that it also incorporates what we call the right to associate. The right to associate with different groups, different people that we want to, different ideological groups. And understand the right to free speech goes beyond just free speech. It includes the right to thought, the right to writing down your ideas, the right to engaging in different kinds of activities that involve speech. Speech could be more than just speaking. It can be, so let's go for an example. Speech can be what you spend your money on. What you spend your money on can be equivocated to speech. And what I mean by that is if you pay for a billboard to say a certain thing that you want to say on it, or if you pay for a certain candidate, or if you pay for a certain kind of political party or political action committee or something like that, that can all be equivocated or to be associated with speech. So understand that these rights are kind of expansive in the way that they've looked at them. Also understand that the First Amendment, so it's adopted as part of the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights are those first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. They are adopted in 1789 as basically a compromise to bring other states into a constitution. So basically you develop a constitution, and there's a bunch of, there's states that want the Constitution, but there's a group of states that just don't want a Constitution. They think that it diminishes the rights of states and the ability of states to have their own authority. And so the Bill of Rights was meant as a compromise to bring some states in. So there were certain states that just didn't want to be part of the Union because it was think about this: the state of New York, the state of Virginia. These were big states that knew that a United States with a federal government was going to take away their authority and their ability to regulate and to be able to control, basically to have power. And so that's where they came up with the idea of these Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights were meant to protect rights for citizens. And so look at those Bill of Rights. The first right, the First Amendment has these 6 protections that they thought were important. And then the Second Amendment, and we're not here to debate that one. So we know what it says and we know what it does, but that one's still controversial today. The Third Amendment. The Third Amendment is so effective that today we don't even think about it, because it was the right to not have your home occupied by the military. So you don't have to house military people. I don't know if anybody has anybody been approached by the Army to have to house anybody at their house? I don't think so. The Fourth Amendment is an important one. Okay. Well, here's a good question here. I want to go to it. Says right here. So this is from Carlton. Do those who say the forced wearing of a mask in certain situations during COVID is a violation of the First Amendment rights have any standing? No. I mean, to be honest, no. I don't think they have any kind of First Amendment free speech. And why I'm saying that is because we're not entangling their speech, where there is a possibility that I don't see a circumstance where that is speech. Now maybe you could come up with something that maybe I'm not looking at. So there's a factual scenario that maybe could involve speech that I'm not thinking of, but I really can't think of one. So where one could have speech is if somebody's wearing a mask that says, I don't like wearing masks, or wearing mask is stupid, or some expletive mask, so it's blank mask. One of the famous cases is an individual who during the Vietnam War went into a courthouse with a jacket, and on the back of the jacket it said blank the draft, used an F word that can be offensive, and that went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that's a free expression. That is a political expression. Yes, it's offensive, but we're not here to regulate. The First Amendment was not meant to determine whether or not language was offensive, but is meant to protect speech. Then we have another question. In the late 1800s, some immigrants were deported for what they said, thinking Emma Goldman and her speeches bordering on anarchy. I think the federal government was afraid of this would lead to sedition. So that's an interesting point. Let me start there. The United States was founded in 1776. We gained a constitution in 1787. And litigation involving the First Amendment and those kind of issues really didn't start until the latter part of the 19th century and really came to fruition in the 20th century. So think about that. We're a country for about 120 years before we really start debating what the First Amendment means. And I would tell you, and if you've been in the group before, but I'll tell you this so you know, those first 10 amendments did not apply to acts of the state. So what I'm saying is, like, the state of Ohio was not regulated by the First Amendment until the 14th Amendment came into place. The 14th Amendment effectively incorporated those first 10 amendments against acts that may be done by the state. So for example, let me just give you an example. In 1800, the state of Massachusetts had an official church that was supported by the state. And it didn't violate the First Amendment because it was the state doing it and not the federal government. The First Amendment only applied to acts done by the federal government. So you're talking about people being deported for what they said. That walks into a very fine line. The case, the famous case out there is you can't go into a crowded theater and yell fire. That's not protected. So what is protected? Well, latter part of the 19th century is, it's a different time, a different situation. Advocating for the overthrow of the United States government might not be protected in the latter part of the 19th century. Today, that's an interesting question. I don't know. Let me give you an example there. In the latter part of the 1960s, 1968, there's a famous case where an individual was at a protest, and his comments were specifically this. He said, if I get drafted and they give me a gun, the first person I'm going to put in my sights is LBJ. And each one of you is old enough to know who LBJ was. Okay? He was charged with a threat to the president. That went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled that that wasn't a threat to the president. It was a political statement, and therefore it was protected. So it really comes down to the facts of the situation and the circumstances. I would tell you that somebody who gets up and advocates for the overthrow of the United States would have to have taken some kind of action to be able to be convicted of a crime, or to, in the area of deportation, that's a little different, because depending on what kind of visa they're in the United States on. When we're talking about a non-citizen and being subject to deportation, that's a little bit different than First Amendment rights. Now, that said, I do need to tell you that people who are not citizens of the United States are protected by our Constitution and have the rights under the Constitution. Yeah, and I think Emma Goldman was, but I think the issue, and I don't know if they, so, you know, we're talking about the 19th century, so it's always kind of a difficult thing to do. The First Amendment wasn't completely fleshed out at that point. I'm telling you right now, I'm looking at it because I'm not completely familiar with everything that Emma Goldman did. It looks like she was an immigrant. Yeah, she was involved with the Haymarket riot a little bit. Sure looks like she was getting people upset in the federal government. I'll have to get a little more up to date on Emma, so I don't know about that. Well, you know, I've introduced some ideas. Okay. Well, you're right about that, about the corporations. It was, but like I said, it was a different time, and we hadn't really fleshed out what the First Amendment meant. And I would tell you that I don't know that we still have it fleshed out, because many times, take today, people who believe that they have a First Amendment argument based upon free exercise will also incorporate it with free speech. So let's talk about, we're talking about COVID. There was recently a case in the Supreme Court involving an order from the state of New York in regard to certain restrictions. And the state of New York had imposed certain restrictions for churches, but had different restrictions or less onerous restrictions for places selling alcohol and other entities. And the argument that was out there was that, hey, you've done a different kind of application of a rule to churches as opposed to those entities that distribute alcohol. And you can't do that. And the Supreme Court agreed. that it can't have disparate type of applications unless there's got to be, and let me tell you what it's got to be. There's got to be a substantial state interest. Now, that was I think that was either a 5-4 or 6-3 decision. What we would call the liberal wing was saying that an international pandemic has a substantial state interest. The more conservative wing of the Supreme Court said, no, that's not a substantial state interest. There's got to be something greater than that. So at least that's where that is. Okay. Yep, let's talk about that. I think that, okay, so on another one, on a different note, I remember from high school a case about a Native American church. Peyote was part of their religion. And it said eventually, I think the Native American church had the right to peyote. So there's an interesting case on that. So what happened is that, and this case arose in the 1980s. There's an individual who is employed by a company. He is a Native American. As part of his Native American culture and ceremonies, he would use peyote. The job required that he take a drug screen. There was a random drug screen one day. He took the drug screen. He tested positive for this peyote. They fired him. He applied for unemployment compensation. He was denied unemployment compensation because he was supposedly fired for just cause. He said, no, it's not just cause. I was practicing my religion, and so therefore I'm entitled to unemployment compensation. And he was also saying I was fired for an unjust cause, so I should be able to get money for that. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled, because the rule is a neutral, generally applicable rule. So that means everybody had to submit to a drug test. Then it was a legitimate rule, even though it did impose some restriction on his religious faith. That general and neutrally applicable rule did not infringe upon his free exercise rights. Now, what was interesting is, here's what the interesting aspect of that case was that then that led to what's a law that basically tried to overturn that ruling and gave some rights to people for their religious rights. Now, the case you're talking about in 73, I think they are able to use it as part of their religion, yes, but this had to do with a later case in the 80s, what I was talking about. That's the funny part about talking about these cases. You can get into a lot of different things. So I've thrown some things out there. We talked about those 6 rights. I'm kind of interested in kind of your questions. I've seen some of the stuff you posted on here, but there are other questions maybe you want to discuss in just a way of discussing. Okay, I'm looking at the Winelands, and they look like they've got something they're discussing. Go ahead.
Well, okay, I'll throw it out there. He's been tempting me to do it.
No, you're the one that started it. And I said, ask him. Go ahead.
So when you were talking about freedom of speech and the idea of talking about overthrowing the government, that in order for that to be like a serious, to get in trouble for doing that, you would have had to take some action. And I mean, look at current events.
Yeah.
We have the president and many of his minions who are doing just that, who are basically saying we need to at first it was count the votes, now it's overturn the election. And they are doing things in order to make that happen. Why is that not being addressed?
Well, I'm going to try and walk this on a very tender line, okay?
See, you're going to regret that you asked us.
No, not at all. No. Let me start out with something. Let me start out with a broad statement. the United States of America is a very dangerous experiment.
Mm.
It's also a tough experiment. We decided that, wow, wouldn't it be a great idea to have a country where everybody gets to think like they want to, say what they want to, practice their faith like they want to, establish any kind of religion they want to, vote for who they want to, and get to do all of these things in a manner they want to. And guess what? You all get to live next to each other. You get to interact with each other, and you got to get along. And yeah, you know, when you came here from the old country, you hated each other, but guess what? You got to get along now, and you got to be Americans. And so let's start out with that statement, okay?
Yeah.
And what that means is that we have some hard discussions in our family. I don't know whose family doesn't have hard discussions, but this is one where we're telling everybody, you gotta be in, you gotta have these hard discussions. So I invite that hard discussion. I think that's great. I think that's a great question. I would say that the president and his, what you call minions, little yellow people running around,
Like mine.
or mine, are at least advocating within the bounds of the law at this time. They're advocating for people, even though it may have some legal implications. They're telling electors, don't vote for the person that who your state has given the votes for. Do the right thing. You know, they're putting it in their own context of words. They've not advocated for the overthrow of the country yet. They have advocated for what they consider the right thing in regard to the election. Now, that may be completely wrong, but I don't know that they've crossed over a border. You see, what I'm trying to say is that to advocate for the overthrow of the country, you got to do several things. You're going to have to say, I think the United States of the government should be overthrown, and you've got to have some kind of plan in place to do it. And you've got to do some act to do it. It has to be serious. So what that LBJ case said is that just saying that you think that the first act that you're going to do when you become, if you become drafted, is to put LBJ in your sights, that is a political statement. He had no intention. There was nothing to show he had an intention to go and kill the president. There has to be some kind of actual act. I mean, they would have to show that he had a gun or that he had some kind of plan or something along those lines. In this particular case, they're going to have to show that the president has some kind of plan to overthrow the government. This is a challenge. This is a challenge to our democracy. It's a challenge that I think some people are offended by. But at the same time, I want to tell you, I think at the end of the day, the winner is our system. I believe strongly in that. I believe today, I'm looking at it right now. Let me look. And most of the state's electors have met, and most of them have cast their ballots exactly as they were instructed to do by the law.
Right.
This is this is one of my things. I'll get on my little thing I like to talk about. You live in a unique country, a country that respects and admires and tries to live up to the rule of law. And because of that, in another country, the president's statements about electoral votes and electoral college votes and such like that would be possibly taken in a different way. But we really respect the law here. We uphold the law. Those electors are going to do what they're supposed to do today because the law tells them to do it. And I believe that fervently, I guess. So I guess that's what I would say to you is that, you know, what I'm looking at is that, yes, the president says a lot of things. Yes, he's pushing the limits of our constitutional government. But I think that our constitutional government is strong enough that we can withstand this president. We've withstood a lot of other presidents.
Yeah, I just like to kind of add to that. I think what this election has brought out is people, even to the local levels, that, you know, you don't think they have a lot of power, counting the ballots and recounting the ballots. They were fearless, absolutely fearless. They stood up for what they believed was right, and they even let the television cameras come in, and and didn't have any problem with the observers coming in. And whenever the president or somebody else in power would try to get them, they were steadfast. And like you said, this really shows that a lot of people respect the law and will stand up for what they believe is right. And those are my heroes. I just, and up in Detroit, you saw it. The people were banging on the glass, and the people inside just kept on counting the ballots.
Now,
Fearless.
I will tell you this, is that a lot of people will, how do I want to say this? Is that, okay. You put it right here. You made a comment about this being a republic. We have a unique country. I
Yeah.
have to tell you, and you can't really compare it to other countries. A lot of people want to put out statements about, oh, what they do in Denmark, or they do in this place and stuff.
Yeah.
You really can't compare us to other countries, because there's no other country that's as pluralistic and as individual, is very protective of individual rights as we are.
Mhm.
The other thing, we're a republic. A lot of people get confused and say we're a democracy. We're a democratic republic.
Mhm.
We now, in this country, we elect over 500,000 different individuals, more than any other country in the world. We elect just everything under the sun. Okay. But we are a republic where we rely on representation to, and in a way, to temper the masses, if you want to call the will of the masses. Our founders were afraid of two things. They had two boogeymen, if you want to cave. One boogeyman was a king, a monarch power. The other one was mob rule. Those were two things that they just really feared. And if you look at those first 10 amendments, that's what they're meant to do. And particularly the First Amendment. The First Amendment is meant to protect the individual, the individual's right. And so let me put something out there to talk about, to think about too. Many people interpret that First Amendment, what they call religion rights, as being what they call a wall between church and state. And that came up because Thomas Jefferson had written a letter, and he referred to it as a wall between church and state. There is nothing in the Constitution that says wall between church and state. And if you look at the history of constitutional interpretation related to those free exercise clauses and establishment clauses, it becomes a little murky. So for example, there was a case involving transportation of students to parochial schools. It was challenged. And ultimately the Supreme Court ruled that transportation is not an establishment of religion, but provision of certain school books may be an establishment. So there's been this, but school vouchers is not an establishment.
Yeah.
So there's a real meandering in a way that establishment clause is interpreted.
Yeah, I remember that, particularly, I went to Catholic school back when, you had 750 people, grades 1 through 8. It was
Right.
And things were starting to change a little bit. I remember particularly, I remember in 8th grade, we had one set of everybody here knows what overhead projectors are, right? It's ancient history. Yeah, we had one set of overhead projectors for religion that came out of our tuition, and we had another set of overhead projectors that were provided by the state as long as they were used for non-religious purposes. And one day the dear nun, she used the wrong one. And she said, "Oh, don't tell anybody. I just made a mistake today." So, but from then on, she was very careful that she used the right projectors for the right class. And
Yeah.
just one other thing, I think about halfway through, around 67, 68, the state funded uh, 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 special ed teachers, but they would have to go into trailers that were, on the campus in the parking lot, but they couldn't come into the school. And the way the state of, if I remember that I was only in grade school, but as I recall, the state of Ohio said we're providing services to students, not to schools. So it wasn't establishment of religion, which I think you were saying.
Yeah, I think that I mean, those are all issues that have to be dealt with and walked through.
Yeah.
So I want to be able to open this up to a later time. So let me talk to you first about a couple things. Are there other
Okay.
questions you had that you came to and you said, "Hey, I really want to talk about this"? I talked to Carlton. I hit your mask question, but maybe you had some other questions or.
Well, when I think about people who are in certain situations and are very blatant about not wearing their mask and therefore jeopardizing the health of others,
Yep.
I think about shouting fire in a crowded theater. Like that's a comparable situation. But I just wondered, where do they have the right to say it's in violation of their First Amendment? I don't see, looking through these 6 rights here, the only possible one, like you said, might be freedom of speech, but I don't see how it would apply.
Well, I think it's either, it potentially could be freedom of association. I don't know. I don't know that it's a First Amendment right, to be honest. But the fact of the matter is that I don't know that anybody wants to really, everybody on both sides trying to weigh this. I don't know that anybody wants to arrest somebody for not wearing a mask. That's just not gonna, no police officer wants to do that. Okay. And so I just don't see that happen. But some of the people who aren't wearing masks really want to be arrested by a police officer.
Yeah.
Or they
Oh,
want to get into a fight, like in a store situation.
yeah.
Right.
Oh, they yell and scream and everything. I've got something that kind of been on my mind the last 20 years or so. And
Well,
that's the whole,
Let's get it out there then.
okay, the whole freedom of association. And, I've been, the older I get, I call it witnessing. I don't call it protesting. Okay. I'm getting old, I'm not into chanting, but I've been known through the years to gather on the street corners and everything, on certain issues. And it's the whole thing about how far can you go with that our group has never had any problem with the police, because by the time we started doing this, we were in our 30s, and we were just not the kind of people, we just wanted to get the message out. But, at what point, does the police, handle that? And there's so few public places, and it really bothers me. There's so few public places where you can gather, you either have to gather in your church or whatever. I mean, if you go on the sidewalks, you got to make sure that, free passage, and that's fine. But, and the government shouldn't, have places for you to assemble and everything. But just that whole idea of assembly and where you can gather and I don't want to say how much you can do before you get away with it, but there just doesn't seem to be any. I mean, you can write your representatives, but that whole freedom of association and where you can meet, and it just, I don't know. It's just, I think about it, And I can't even ask a question about it. It's just something I feel. Does that make any sense?
No, it does. It makes
It's just
sense. Here's
been
what I
really
would
on my
say.
mind, because I'm not out to overthrow the government. I'm just, it's just like sometimes it's just
Well,
you just want to get your message across, and you gather street corners, and they call you a bunch. I remember one time we were on the street corners, and somebody yelled out, "Get a job!" and we were all employed.
well,
Yeah.
understand, I guess, you always have to start out with,
Yeah.
you start out with this.
Okay.
Who is the First Amendment meant to protect you from?
The government.
Right. The government is always the threat that they're protecting you from.
Right.
The First Amendment does not protect you from other people.
You're
Okay?
right. You're right.
So
Yeah.
the person who goes by and yells obscenities to you,
Oh, yeah, we
or
get them.
insults you, they're just as protected as you are.
Yeah, we just ignored them over the
Right.
years. We just why throw gasoline on a fire?
In regard to public places, the sidewalk definitely is a public place,
Yeah.
open to the
yeah.
public.
And
You're
we've
able
always
to,
made sure people could walk by. We
Sure.
try to be polite.
as long as the sidewalk is open and free
Yeah.
for movement,
Yeah.
then you are entitled to your free speech. Now,
Mhm.
let's say that your free speech attracts others
Yeah.
who are disruptive.
This
Or
has
who are
happened
walking the
here in
streets.
Toledo. This has happened in Toledo.
Well,
Yeah.
if that happens, you could have you could lose that right. They could probably remove you because it's caused this kind of disruption.
Yeah.
I think that you understand is that police officers have a tough situation in
Mhm.
trying to enforce or
Mhm.
protect the public.
Yeah.
So you're protesting one thing, and you're saying, "Hey, I'm against such and such." Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, think about the person too who is on the other side. I've seen this too.
Oh yeah.
I've seen the preachers out there who want to tell everybody where they're going when they die.
Yeah.
They have just as much right, but people get offended by that.
Mhm. Yeah.
We have to, I guess that, on both sides, we have to remember that whatever the language, whatever the word is, whatever the message is, we have to protect it. And what I always tell people is, if somebody doesn't like it, that means it probably needs to be protected.
Good point.
I mean,
Good point.
now you may not agree with that, okay? But what I'm saying is that
That's a good point, though.
if somebody's out there saying something
Mhm.
and there's others who don't like it, then that
Yeah.
message and that person probably needs to be protected. It's something to think about.
Good point. Yeah. Because I've gone, I've seen people protesting other things, and I go, I don't agree with that, but I'm no saint, but I go, hey, you've been out there and been called names, so I go, now I know how it feels, kind of a thing.
Other questions.
Yeah.
So you know what? I'd like to, and I want to do this now while we've got the time. And I don't know what can be done, Liz, but I would tell you that next Monday at 3, I have the availability.
Okay.
And I could do that if everybody would like to come back and we can talk more about the Constitution. If that would be helpful to you, I would give you a little more information. We talk a little bit more about the development and those rights. I'll get some cases out. We'll talk about some cases. If that works for your schedule. And Liz can put it out and say, this is the makeup for what Judge Reger's mess up was.
Come now. Stop it.
We can definitely add that in. That fits in our schedule here, I think, as far as I can see.
Okay. I've got it on my schedule.
All right.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Once
Thank
again,
you so much.
I want to apologize for sometimes the schedule gets a little gets outside of me, what I can do.
That's all right. You're always fascinating to listen to.
Understand.
You're always prepared.
Yeah.
I mean, seriously,
Yeah.
I've sat in your courtroom and listened to you preside, and I am always impressed in there. And you've never let me down. Like seriously, you are amazing.
Yeah.
You are so articulate about what you're trying to say, and you're so even-handed, and I just think you're great.
Well,
Anyway,
thank you so much.
You
I
are-
do want to keep inviting people to the courtroom. You can come and watch. We'd love to have you.
it's fascinating.
It is, very much so.
It is fascinating.
Yeah, you walk out of there and you say, they did what?
Well, I'll give you one from last Friday. Okay.
Okay.
So I had a woman in front of me last Friday. She's charged with a couple felonies, but also a DUI and a driving under a DUI suspension. So she's right in front of me with her attorney. And I said, she doesn't have privileges, does she? Nope, Judge, she has no privileges. And she can't drive, right? Nope, she can't drive. So I said, well, you know what? She's here by herself. I'm not going to ask her to say anything, but you really got to talk to her about how she got here and how she's leaving here, because she shouldn't be driving a motor vehicle. She walked out of the courtroom. She walked downstairs. I had security follow her. She went into the parking lot. She got in her car and she left.
Ah! Ah!
Now, we contacted BGPD to say, can you go pick her up? They were busy with a traffic accident, so they weren't able to, but we
Uh-huh.
issued a warrant for her arrest, and she's coming in on Friday to discuss this.
Oh my.
That would be fun to watch.
You think she'll show up?
Go ahead, this Friday, you want to come up and watch? We've got a full docket for you.
Okay. What time?
I don't know if we haven't set a time on her. We said show up whenever.
We
Okay.
can- Whenever she can drive there.
Exactly what seems to happen.
Okay. Well, give us a summary Monday.
We need to all chip in for her taxi fare.
Okay.
You can-
Well, I'll see you next Monday, and Liz, if you can
Okay.
advertise to other people, that's fine too. Thank
Okay,
you.
Thank you.
Sounds
Have a
good.
good day.
Thank you.
We'll
You
see ya.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody.